Good morning, Rockingham.
Good morning.
Seems such a long time since I've been here. I was away house sitting for 8 weeks, come home for 4 days, and then off to Brisbane for 2 more weeks. So I was talking last week, and a couple of people found out I was doing the sermon this week, and they says, can we have a nice sermon, one that won't make us squirm? Apparently I normally make people squirm in their seats. So I don't know whether this is an easy-going one, but after the pastor was talking there this morning about fathers and Father's Day, I thought of doing a Father's Day one. But what he said there this morning about how good fathers are, and I think, as every father knows, there are times when fathers are not quite so good. There are times when we fail, there are times when we don't fail. And my sermon this morning is about what God does with failure. Today we're going to talk about failure. Do we have any failures in our midst this morning? Anyone want to admit that they're a failure? Yes, we have one. I'll admit. Yes, I see a few more hands going up. Failure is almost a taboo word in today's society. We all like to talk about our successes, our wins, all our good points. We like to brag about them. We like to tell everybody about them. But what about our failures? It's different, isn't it? We are very reluctant to talk about our failures. We like to forget them. We like to pretend that they never happened. We're ashamed of them. But the Bible tells us that every one of us has failed or sinned, and that we need God's help. In Romans chapter 3, verses 23, we read there that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter if we have failed big or small, once or many times. God treats our failures, all our failures, the same. They are all sin, and each one will only reap death. The good news is that failure is an event, not a destiny. This is good news because we all fail sooner or later, and if we're honest, we all fail over and over again. Failure doesn't mean that you have blown everything. It means that you've got some hard lessons to learn. Failure doesn't mean you are a permanent loser. It means you aren't as smart as what you thought you were. Failure doesn't mean that you should give up. It means that you need the Lord to show you the next step. Failure doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. It means that God has a better plan. Today we're going to look at the failure of a man who ate, drank, talked and walked side by side with Jesus for 3.5 years. It's a story of a failure so shocking that we still talk about it 2,000 years later. But it's also a story of how Jesus not only forgave him, but how Jesus restored him and made him anew. We find the story in Matthew chapter 26, 69 to 75. You'd just like to turn to that one. It's the one we had in our Bible reading. Matthew chapter 26, and verses 69 to 75. Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, Thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him and said unto him that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, Surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech betrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. Jesus had been arrested and put on trial in the palace of the high priest. All the disciples had fled and deserted Jesus. Peter and John had followed the crowd from a distance to the palace. John followed into the palace, but Peter stayed out in the courtyard. Now let's look at the story and see how Jesus reacts to Peter's denial. And we find that in Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And verses 60 to 62. Luke chapter 22, verses 60 to 62. And Peter said, Man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. There are really two parts to Peter's story. His threefold denial that night Jesus was arrested, and how Christ forgave and restored him. The first part depends wholly on Peter. He was in charge of his own failure. The second part depends wholly on Jesus. He was the only one who could restore Peter. As Peter's story abundantly proves, it's not our initial failure that ruins us. It's what happens next that matters. When we have failed, especially when we have failed those we love the most, our mind becomes a swirl of emotions, embarrassment, anger, fear, shame, and despair. We feel unworthy because of what we did. When we have hurt someone deeply, we want to know if they still love us, or have I blown everything? Will they ever forgive me? And more importantly, can I ever forgive myself? Peter never forgot what happened when he denied Christ. As long as he lived, he never forgot that terrible night. Tradition says that he would start weeping whenever he heard a rooster crow. Tradition also says that he would wake up every night and pray during the hour when he denied the Lord. How does Jesus restore his fallen disciples? The answer comes in 5 stages. In the first stage, he sent for him. When the women arrived at the tomb early on Sunday morning, an angel announced the good news of Jesus' resurrection and gave them instructions. And we read this in Mark chapter 16 and verses 5 to 7. Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 16, verses 5 to 7. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were afraid. And he said unto them, Be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way and tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. The instruction was, go, tell his disciples and Peter. Wasn't Peter one of the disciples? Apparently Peter's denial had separated him from the other disciples. In Desire of Ages, page 793, we read, since the death of Christ, Peter had been bowed down with remorse. His shameful denial of the Lord and the Saviour's look of love and anguish were ever before him. Of all the disciples, he had suffered most bitterly. No doubt he wondered to himself many times, what am I now? Am I a traitor or am I a disciple? Just before Peter's triple denial, Peter had bragged that if anyone else deserted Jesus, he would never desert him. How wrong he was. Under pressure, the bold apostle had turned to butter. Are you one of those men who were with Jesus? Jesus? I don't know him. Didn't I see you with his disciples? I tell you, I don't know the man. Aren't you a follower of Jesus of Nazareth? He begins to swear as only a fisherman can swear. I tell you, I don't know that man. In the distance, a rooster crowed. Moments later, Jesus was brought out from his trial before the high priest Caiaphas. And in Luke 22:61 says that the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. That's when the full impact of his sin hit him. Realising what he had done, Peter went outside and wept bitterly. And after all that, the risen Christ doesn't write Peter off as a permanent failure. He doesn't put him in the biggest loser category or even the weakest link category. Jesus still has plans for Peter, plans to give him a hope and a future, plans to give him a second chance. In stage 2, Jesus met with Peter. Where did Peter go after he denied Christ? The answer is we don't know for certain because the Bible doesn't say. But I guess we can surmise that Peter did what most of us do when we have blown it big time. When we have made a huge mistake, the last thing we want is to be around other people, especially the ones who know us best and love us the most. Having let them down, we don't want to see them at all. Sin separates us from God and from God's people. Sin isolates us so that the devil can convince us that having made such a stupid mistake, no one wants to be around us again, ever. So we spend our hours in a miserable prison of self-imposed solitary confinement. I think that's what happened to Peter that weekend. Wherever he was, he must have felt alone in the world. The last thing we are told is that after Jesus looked at him, Peter wept bitterly. We are not told where Peter was during the crucifixion on Friday or during the burial late that afternoon. We can only guess that he retreated to some lonely spot, there to replay those awkward moments in his mind so that he could beat himself up all over again and ask why. Why did I do it? What made me think I was so much better than the others? How could I have been so stupid? And what does Jesus think of me now? We find an answer to that last question in the fact that Jesus made a special appearance to Peter sometime on Easter Sunday. We don't know where or when precisely, nor do we know how long the meeting lasted, but twice the New Testament mentions that the meeting took place. Luke 24 verse 34. Luke 24 and verse 34. Saying, the Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared to Simon. And also in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 4 to 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And verses 4 to 5. and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, and then of the 12. Cephas was another word for Peter. So we see there that Christ appeared to Peter twice before he met with the other disciples. Now, why did Jesus meet with Peter before he met with the rest of the disciples? What amazing grace on the part of Jesus. Since Peter denied Christ, things must first be settled between the two of them. With wisdom and grace, Christ comes to Peter and doesn't wait for Peter to make the first move. There was to be no public humiliation. Stage 3, he challenged him. Now we come to John chapter 21. John chapter 21. John chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise showed he himself. There were together Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. They say unto him, We also go with thee. They went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said unto them, Children, have ye any meat? They answered him, No. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said unto Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girt his fisher's coat unto him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, but they were not far from land, for as it were dragging 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. As soon as they were come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on, and bread. And Jesus said unto them, Bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153. For all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. And Jesus said unto them, Come and dine. And none of the disciples dare ask him, Who art thou? Knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then cometh and taketh bread and giveth them, and fish likewise. This is now the 3rd time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was risen from the dead. It is the evening on the Sea of Galilee, not long after the resurrection. Peter and the 6 other disciples had spent the night fishing and ended up catching nothing. In the morning, a man calls from the shore, telling them to put their nets on the other side of the boat and they will catch fish. They end up with so many fish they can't haul the net because it was so full. When he realises the man is Jesus, Peter impulsively jumps in the water and begins swimming to shore. It turns out that Peter and the other disciples caught 153 fish simply by obeying the word of Christ. If Christ was watching the disciples from the shore at night, why didn't he speak up sooner? Why allow his men to toil for hours in frustration? The answer is they needed to fail. Failure in this case was a necessary prerequisite to eventual success. If that unidentified man had spoken up sooner, they would doubtless have rejected his advice. What do you know? We're professional fishermen. We know where to fish. We've spent years fishing this lake. But let the night pass and the sun come up, and they are ready at last to listen to the voice of the Lord. So it is with all of us. The Lord allows us to fail in our own strength, so that we may learn that only by his power will we ever succeed. The disciples needed to fail so that they could learn to depend upon Christ for their victories. Sometimes it takes shameful failure for us finally to wake up and see our need of Christ. Despite his doubts, Peter follows Christ's commands and ends up catching 153 fish. Interesting to see that they counted the fish. The question that Jesus asked is, Peter, will you obey me even when it makes no sense? It is the same question the Lord asks us every day. Will we obey even when we think we have a better way? Will we obey even when the way forward seems unclear? Will we obey when our instincts tell us to do something different? Will we obey when we have failed on our own? And number 5, he reinstated him. After the breakfast was over, Peter and Jesus took a walk together. And this is the part of the story most of us know best. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Peter and Jesus had this conversation around a charcoal fire in verse 9. The particular Greek word for charcoal fire is used in only one other place in the New Testament, and that's in John 18 verse 18, where it refers to the charcoal fire in the courtyard where Peter denied the Lord. The Lord allows us to fail in our own strength so that we may learn that only by his power will we ever succeed. By one fire, he says, I don't know him. By another fire, he says, Lord, you know I love you. By one charcoal fire, he denied Christ. By one charcoal fire, he is restored by Christ. Several questions come to mind as we read this passage. Why did Jesus ask Peter 3 times, do you love me? And that was because Peter had denied him 3 times. Why did Jesus do this publicly? Because Peter denied him publicly. The other disciples needed to hear Peter openly declare his love for Christ. Without hearing these words, the doubts would linger forever. The man who had been so boastful, so sure of himself, so confident of his own courage, is now thoroughly humbled. Jesus' first question, do you love me more than these, was a subtle reminder of his previous boast to be more loyal than the other disciples. In his reply, Peter declares his love for Christ, but he refuses to compare himself with anyone else. As painful as this was, it was absolutely necessary. Jesus is cleaning the wound so that it might be properly healed. He's getting rid of Peter's guilt and shame by dealing with it openly. Consider what Christ doesn't do. And I was interested in Peter's story this morning, where the first thing the grandmother told him that he was wrong and he shouldn't have done it. Christ doesn't do. He doesn't try to make Peter feel guilty. He doesn't humiliate him publicly. He doesn't ask him, are you sorry for what you did? He doesn't make him promise to do better. He just asks one question. Do you love me? Once we have hurt someone we love, it is hard to look them in the face, and it is harder still to be questioned about our true commitment. How could you have done that? What were you thinking? Do you even love me at all? But the questions must be asked and the answers must be given, and they must be repeated if the truth is to be fully told. Peter needed to see the enormity of his sin, and he needed to hear Jesus ask these searching questions. Only then could he grasp the multitude of Christ's forgiveness. Only then could he be truly restored. Without the pain, he would not get better. Truth will set you free, but it will hurt you first. Often we don't get better because we don't want to face the hard truth about what we have said and done. But until we face the truth about ourselves, we can never be free. There are 3 qualifications for those who would serve the Lord. The first is love. The second is love. And the third is love. First we love, then we serve. First we love, then we speak. First we love, and then we lead. When Christ asked the question the 3rd time, Peter's heart is grieved, and he blurts out, "Lord, you know all things." With those words, Peter renounced all his self-confidence. On that fateful night in the upper room, he thought he knew himself, but he didn't. Now he's not so sure. He doesn't even trust his own heart. Instead, he trusts in the Lord who knows all things. This is a mighty step forward in Christian growth. It is a great advance to come to the place where you can say with conviction, "My trust is in the Lord alone." Sometimes we have to hit bottom and hit it hard before we can say those words. Did it work? Did the painful surgery produce the desired healing? Yes, it did. Peter never denied Christ again. And just a few days later, on the day of Pentecost, fully restored, he stood in the temple courts and preached a mighty gospel sermon to the very men who had crucified the Lord. 3,000 people were saved that day. The old Peter was gone forever. A new man was born when Jesus restored his fallen disciple. And the last step was he re-enlisted him. Early church tradition says that Peter was crucified upside down in Rome because he said that he was not worthy to be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. Although he failed in the past, in the end he will glorify God in his death. In the upper room, Peter had rashly boasted that he was willing to follow Christ to prison and to death. It's as if Jesus tells him, "You were right about that, more right than you knew. Someday you will have a chance to keep your promise, and I know that in that day you will not fail." The early historians tell us that Peter lived and died faithfully to Jesus to the very end. And so we come to the end of the message. What does Christ do with failure? He redeems it. God is able to forget our past. Why can't we? He throws our sins into the depths of the sea and puts up a sign on the shore which reads, "No fishing." Peter remains a figure of surpassing interest to us. We can't get enough of him. We know him well because we see him every morning when we look in the mirror. We love Peter because we can see ourselves in his story. In fact, his story is our story. For all of us, the process of Christian growth is long and painful with many ups and downs. Peter the rock often seemed very unrock-like. It took repeated failure to produce rock-solid character in him. But Jesus never gave up on his man. Here is the final irony. From beginning to end, Jesus believed in Peter more than Peter believed in himself. And so it will be for all of us. If your life was perfect, then what would you need me for? The real hero of Peter's story isn't Peter. The real hero is Jesus. That's why John 21 is in the Bible, so that all of us Peter types would know that though we fall again and again, by God's grace, we can keep on getting up. What mercy, what grace. If he did it for Peter, he can do it for me, and he can do it for you. I'm just going to finish off with a little poem here, and it's called "And God Said If." If you never felt pain, then how would you know that I'm a healer? If you never went through difficulty, how would you know that I'm a deliverer? If you never had trial, how could you call yourself an overcomer? If you never felt sadness, how would you know that I'm a comforter? If you never made a mistake, how would you know that I'm forgiving? If you were never in trouble, how would you know that I will come to your rescue? If you never were broken, then how would you know that I can make you whole? If you never had a problem, how would you know that I can solve them? If you never had any suffering, then how would you know what I went through? If you never went through the fire, then how would you become pure? If I gave you all things, how would you appreciate them? And if I never corrected you, how would you know that I love you? If you had all power, then how would you learn to depend upon me? If your life was perfect, then what would you need me for? Amen.